In this episode, we mention cancer and hospice care, and we talk about death throughout. Welcome back to Grief in Common, Season 2. I'm here with Sarah. She's a bereavement support worker, and I'm Rosie. You might recognise me if you listen to some of the episodes in Season 1. I'm 22 and my dad died when I was 18, whilst I was in my first year of university in my first term, and he died in hospice care. And so for the past 4 years, I have been navigating my journey with grief. And Sarah, if you want to talk a little bit about your experiences.
Hi, Rosie. It's great to be on the podcast with you today, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat. So, I'm one of the bereavement support workers here at Winston's Wish, and like many people, I guess, who work in bereavement, we've got our own personal bereavement experiences as well, and very much at Winston's Wish, I'm here to support young people who are bereaved at whatever stage they are and however long ago it was. So hopefully we can have a good chat between us today about lots of stuff, and I'll do my best to bring my insights into the chat as well.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about conversations about grief and how you can maybe start those. And Sarah, what is your top piece of advice for maybe someone who's just been bereaved and has to talk about that to someone else?
I guess the main thing really is to think about who you're going to tell and who you feel most comfortable with, because it can be really daunting, really scary to reach out for the first time. So it's about actually thinking about your support network and who have you got around you who you feel most comfortable to approach. So that really is the very first step when it comes to kind of reaching out. And also, a lot of the time, young people would say, I don't even know where to begin or how to start. And that's okay too. It could be about preparing about maybe what you want to say. And also, it could be about reassuring that person who you tell that actually you don't necessarily want anything from them other than for them to listen. So it can sometimes be helpful to really think about maybe how the other person might feel in that moment, and how we can kind of tell them what we need. Does that make sense?
Yes. So in my experience, my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer before he died. So I had some time to process what that meant for us as a family and also for myself. And he actually died about a month after I moved from Belfast to London for uni. So I flew home and I was there with him when he died. And I felt like the biggest step for me and my grief after he died was telling people. Because, Sarah, you're so right. Sometimes you don't want people to be all over you or, trying to give you all these pieces of advice. You just want them to be there for you, and maybe for them to say, look, if you need me, I'm here, whatever you need. Don't feel pressured to contact me. Don't feel pressured to reply to my messages. I think they're all such important bits of advice. I was really lucky because I had quite a solid support network with my mum, and then I've got 2 younger siblings, so we were all kind of in it together, and then with my family. And then my friends were so understanding because they'd basically been with me through the whole journey before, which was about 2 years before my dad died. I think the thing I struggled most with was maybe the people in my network who I didn't know so well. So obviously I had just moved to uni. I'd known the people I was living with for 3-4 weeks. And it can be quite intense to go back into that situation and say, well, this is just a major thing that's happened in my life and I'm not really sure how to approach it with you because I don't really know you that well. I think it's okay to be worried and be a bit nervous about that, because you're essentially letting these people who you don't know that well into your life. And they were the conversations that I struggled the most with. On the same wavelength as that, then you also have to tell like your university lecturers and, you know, people in positions of power and leadership what's happened. And sometimes they're not always as empathetic as you might hope. So, Sarah, do you have any advice for people in situations like that, telling people that may not know how to respond?
Wow, you know, what an incredible, difficult time that must have been for you. And to have these really difficult conversations, you know, it seems like you've done a lot of reflection kind of on them. And, you know, it's a big sense of overwhelm sometimes that we hear from young people around, like you've just mentioned, you know, all the people from your family, friends, people you don't know very well, you know, lecturers, professionals, you know, you've got all these people and it can seem really, really overwhelming. So the best thing really, I guess, I would encourage to start kind of opening up to those that you know most and have that good relationship like we mentioned beforehand. Then hopefully it becomes easier the more times that you open up. It can help to have that awareness that not everybody is going to respond how you would want them to and need them to. And we get young people telling us that, you know, especially if they reached out for the first time and that's the response they've got, they can become very closed and it can discourage them from reaching out further. So as a long answer there, Rosie, sorry, I'll get to the point in a minute, but it's that what I said before in terms of that prep. Who you're going to tell, what you're going to say to them. Sometimes saying that off the bat and just saying, look, I'm naming this, okay, this is really awkward for me and it's really personal and awkward, I don't know you very well, etc. You know, and naming it sometimes can really help. And again, saying to them, you know, I'm giving you this piece of information and this is what I need from you. So really thinking about whoever it is that you're going to tell, really how you want to communicate your needs. And yeah, if anything they say is really difficult and can stir a lot of emotion, then it's relying on them support networks. You know, you could always talk to Winston's Wish as well, you know, to really think through them feelings that might come up for you when somebody doesn't respond as well as what you would hope. There is always someone out there, whether it be Winston's Wish or whether it be a support network of your own that you can reach out to in their moments. And yeah, just really be kind to yourself.
So Sarah, there when you were speaking, you talked about setting boundaries and addressing the feelings that you're feeling when you're grieving. And in my opinion, that is so important. I think people overlook setting boundaries because sometimes that can be quite scary and quite nerve-wracking. But in my experience, that has been so helpful. When I first spoke to my friends about my grief, they were excellent and I couldn't have asked for them to be any better. It's your grief and you're going to process that and deal with that in whichever way works best for you. And so in my opinion, it's so important that you set those boundaries with the people in your network, your friends, your family, or, you know, your teachers, lecturers, because they should know how to work best with you. Sarah, have you got any more advice for how young people who are experiencing grief might set those boundaries?
Yeah, boundaries is a really good word to use there, Rosie. And like you say, it can be incredibly difficult, which is why, you know, it's about that being kind to yourself. Because when we're grieving, we're dealing with so much already that it can be so difficult to then think, what do I need and what do I want? So I hope that, you know, anybody listening to this podcast who is in that situation will be able to reflect on that themselves and first step thinking about our boundaries and what we need. Like you said, Rosie, no one size fits all with this. So even if you've got a friend who has loads of experience of supporting other friends with grief, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to know how to support you, because your grief is so individual. And also think about how you want to communicate. So is it text message? Sometimes actually writing a letter. Sometimes people like to do. I know in some schools, when we talk to young people and professionals, things such as like a thought box or something at home or at school. Sometimes, young people like to kind of write things down, put it in the box, and then the professional or, the friend or the parent can kind of look at that, and it's just another way of communicating. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question there, Rosie. But no, it's really important to set boundaries. How did you find kind of how the university were with you in terms of the education while you were grieving?
I wouldn't say that their response took me by surprise, but I would say that there are a lot of professionals who are not adequately equipped by their schools, universities, to deal with grief and respond to grief in their students. And the processes at my uni weren't, I'm trying to find a way to say this diplomatically, but I don't think they were refined enough. I had quite a difficult experience with the university in my first term because my dad died about a month and a half before my exam started and about a month before Christmas, 2 months before Christmas. It was the point in the term where we were implementing our learning. We had tests and quizzes and assignments due and group work, and I just don't think that the university were able to meet my needs because they didn't really offer me any support. I'm still to this day, 4 years later, not really sure what support they do have. And in those past 4 years, I have been made aware of other students at the same uni who have also experienced bereavement and haven't been offered much support. And I don't think it's the university's fault. I just think that in the UK as a whole, there's a lot more we could be doing to support young people experiencing grief, because it would be naive to think that, people over the age of 18 aren't going to struggle when something happens, because I'd only just turned 18. It was like the start of my adult life. I'd only been living on my own for 4 weeks, so for 18 years, my mum cooked for me, she did my washing. I mean, I still had chores and stuff, but at uni, you're basically doing everything yourself. I was also working a part-time job, and I think my independence really took a hit because the university couldn't really help me. So my extenuating circumstances was just a whole thing that I don't think the uni have nailed. And then just a few other accommodations that I think they could have made, they didn't. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there in the UK. But I have heard experiences from other young people who had excellent support at their university. So all hope is not lost. I just think when you're talking to your university about what's happened, you need to be clear. You need to set boundaries. You need to tell them what you need from the university. I think maybe one of my big problems was that I expected the uni to have dealt with this so many times before that they would know what I needed, and that's not the case. And so I didn't say, this is what I need from you as a new student and a student who's been recently bereaved. But in hindsight is great, and at the time I was navigating the first major loss in my life, so
like you just said, that's going back to being kind to yourself. You've just been plunged into grief there. You aren't expected to be on form and thinking clearly and, all of this. So, in hindsight, it is easy to go back and say, well, this. And, when I'm talking and I'm kind of encouraging young people to maybe reflect on this or maybe think about this, do this, the reality of it can be very difficult. And unfortunately, the services like you mentioned, across the board in terms of, support, it's so mixed. And I'm so sorry to hear that you had that experience. And I really do hope that things are changing, and people are starting to recognise, actually, maybe we need to do something about this and change policies or change the way we see bereavement. And I think maybe that's a whole wider societal thing, maybe. I don't know. The one word that's popping out to me all the time is expectation. For me, it feels like when you were talking there, Rosie, there's an expectation of you to still be on form and still be doing all this work exams and still kind of coping. There's like an expectation that you should be coping. Is that how it felt for you?
There is an expectation, and a lot of the people that are at uni have obviously experienced grief before. One of the things that I think about now is that whole experience, like the immediate effects after my dad died, was that now I can see that it's made me more resilient. I'm stronger, I'm confident, I'm willing to talk about my experiences and, use my voice to advocate for other young people going through the same thing. You said something very important earlier, Sarah, that grief is not one size fits all, and it presents itself differently in everyone. And even though when someone dies, life goes on, sometimes in that moment you feel like it doesn't and that you really don't know what else to do. And there should be support services out there, which there are in the likes of Winston's Wish, but in terms of at uni and at schools, that help the young people keep putting one foot in front of the other. I'm not sure that that's an expectation as much as it should be like a given. That's my experience. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. It's speaking from experience, isn't it, Rosie? And it's really great that you can advocate for other young people as well, and that you've built all this resilience from all what you've gone through. And we hear that a lot, actually, from young people. And it's at the time when you're plunged into that grief, it can feel very all-consuming. And if only we could see ahead, it would bring us a lot of comfort. But we can. At that time, we cannot. So we have to rely on these support networks and these people outside of us. And then when they are struggling really to know what to do or how to support, then that's when grief in itself is incredibly difficult. It can be even more difficult when that support isn't there. So I'm really glad that you had amazing friends and got lots of support in that way, because that was really important. One thing I was thinking of was, I don't know whether you've felt like this before at university, but certainly I've had my own experience of it, and I know young people have that I've supported in terms of like worrying to kind of bring the grief up. So even though you've said, this is what's happened, they've been there for you, actually sometimes there's silence. And at times young people might actually just want a bit of a check-in of, hey, just checking in, how you doing, bringing up that bereavement. I know one young person that I did support, so they was working at the time, and they're having quite a lot of time off sick because physically, as we know, grief impacts us on all levels. And their manager, I think, eventually said to them, do you think actually it's related back to your grief and this is why you keep feeling unwell? And that young person really, like, it was a turning point for that young person because it helped them reflect of actually, let's go back to my grief. Actually, maybe it is, and maybe I need support with that. And it wasn't until the manager then, brought up that grief and just questioned it, that young person could have said, no, it isn't, and that's absolutely fine. But sometimes I think other adults around us can be very cautious about bringing up the topic and asking these questions and things, because there is a balance. You don't want somebody, I think, like you said, Rosie, constantly checking in, constantly bringing things up. But at the same time, if something's coming up naturally, just say it. Just say it. If it's natural, just say it, I don't know, what are your thoughts with that, Rosie? Because it can be a fine line between space, but also acknowledgement as well.
In my opinion, the person grieving always has the right to say, no, I don't want to talk about it, or it has nothing to do with that, or maybe it's just not the right time for that young person to talk about it. In my experience, it just never occurred to me that some of the problems I was having was down to grief. For 2 years after my dad died, I had really severe insomnia, and my mum encouraged me to go to the doctor about the fact that I wasn't sleeping. And when I went to the doctor, she said, well, has anything happened in your life recently? And then I kind of told her my story, and she was like, yeah, it's probably grief. And that was fine, because for me, that was a way for me to figure out how I could process the grief that I was experiencing so that I could sleep. But I think it's difficult because sometimes you see it in other people and you want to say, but you're right, it's a fine line between acknowledgement and, maybe nagging. But as I said, the young person always has the right to say, I don't want to hear it. And that's totally fine. If they're not ready to hear it, they're not ready to hear it. There's 3 of us, me, I'm the oldest, and my 2 siblings, and we all experienced our grief very, very differently. I am an open book. If you ask me a question, I will answer it. I will talk about any aspect of my grief and my journey that people want to know, because I think it's really important that other young people know that they're not alone. But likewise, if that's not something that you're open to talking about, and maybe humour is not your coping mechanism, then that's fine too. You should never feel forced to talk about your grief. I probably mention about my dad once a day, either seriously or in a jokey way, because I want my friends and my network to know that it's okay to talk to me about it, because maybe one day if something happens to them and they have to experience grief, then they'll know that they can come and speak to me.
Sadly, we have had young people who have spoke to us who have said that they hadn't even had any acknowledgement. They've gone back to school, for example, and not one teacher has said to them, really sorry, I've heard what's happened. Not one person has acknowledged that loss, and it'd be a very lonely place if nobody's acknowledging it. But like you said, Rosie, the autonomy lies with you. So regardless of what anyone might kind of ask you or bring up, remember that it's yourself that has that autonomy, that you can share as much as you feel comfortable. And if you don't want to talk about it, have that courage to say, I just can't right now, I'm not in that place. In terms of, I guess, new friends and new people around you, I guess, have you got any thoughts around kind of it being brought up in conversations with new people, in terms of maybe your own experience, Rosie? You've met somebody new and they're kind of asking about your dad or your family setup or anything like that?
It's been mentioned a couple times. I did a placement year last year, my third year of uni, and I think it's still very normal now to refer to your parents or your mum and dad, and this is the 21st century, so that's not necessarily always the setup that's going to be there, not just for people who have experienced grief, but just in general. And I was in a conference, and I was in a meeting within that conference, and one of the facilitators said, "Oh, Rosie, your mum and dad, they were born in that era. What do they have to say about it?" Something along those lines. And in front of the whole room, I basically turned around and went, "Oh, well, my mum would think X, Y, and Z, but actually my dad's dead." Everyone else in the room knew because they were my colleagues and I worked with them, and I'm very open and it's all over my LinkedIn and everything. But in terms of the facilitator, I could tell that he was definitely a bit taken back. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with him feeling like he maybe overstepped or he shouldn't make those assumptions. One, so he doesn't make those assumptions again. And two, because that's my journey, that's my experience, and I am going to correct you if, you're wrong in front of everyone, especially when everyone else knows. And that's okay. Maybe next time he'll be a bit more careful with the way he words things. But in terms of bringing it up, I have no problem with it. If someone asks me, I'll answer. But in saying that, if I knew that someone else had been through grief or something similar, I would never bring it up first. So if I was having a conversation with someone who had also experienced grief, and maybe I knew, but it, wasn't all over their social media, I wouldn't bring it up first. I wouldn't say anything because I don't think that's my right. I think everyone's entitled to share what they want when they want. We might want to talk about your grief all the time. It might help you process it better. It might help you remember the person. In my case, I really like speaking about my dad. I'm the person I am today because of him and because of the grief. And I'm very happy talking about him, and it does help me remember him and how far I've come. But likewise, I would never expect someone else just to openly talk about their grief if they didn't want to, or because I was.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely agree with what you're saying there, Rosie, because I think I'm just imagining a young person who's bereaved, who is going about their day. Hey, Rosie, let's catch up. And then the day is full of helpful distractions. And maybe they need that day. They actually don't want to focus on their grief, and actually just meeting up with you, Rosie, is just a great distraction, and we can forget about being a young person who's bereaved. We can just be that young person who's hanging out with their friend. And sometimes when we bring up grief, it puts us in that different place. We suddenly then kind of go back to that place of grief with all them feelings, and like you said, they might not want that. So absolutely. And I think if anybody is kind of not sure, shall I mention it, shall I not, but maybe at the end of that meeting, just give each other a hug or whatever, and be like, I'm here for you, or contact me anytime, something as like a parting I'm here reassurance thing, I think could be the most helpful, actually, Rosie. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that although grief is a part of you, and, as young people, we've experienced grief, we don't have to make grief our whole identity. This has been a very heavy conversation. So why don't we end on maybe your favourite way to take care of yourself? Self-care. Top tip.
Gosh, now you put me on the spot there, Rosie. I've actually been reflecting a lot on self-care recently, because I think before I would have said like a bubble bath or something like that, putting on your favourite film and just kind of cozying up. But for me, I think top one would be to be kind to yourself, and I've mentioned that a few times, so I think that's why I'm going to end with that. self-care could also be not just them things that you do physically, but actually mentally, what you tell yourself and that inner critic, I guess. And just to take a breath and know that you're going through such a difficult time, but everything that you're feeling is okay and you will be okay. That would be my number one, I think, Rosie.
Perfect. Thank you for listening to this episode of Grief in Common. Remember to take care of yourself and put yourself first. And thank you very much, Sarah, for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Rosie.
This podcast is brought to you by Talk Grief, powered by Winston's Wish, the UK's first children and young people's bereavement charity.
Listen to young people from different backgrounds have honest conversations about their grief and experiences.
You might hear us laugh, cry, and everything in between.
We hope that these conversations give you the confidence to talk about your own grief.
If you're grieving and over the age of 13, this podcast is suitable for you, and we hope it helps you feel less alone.
From teenagers to young adults, students to young professionals, we're all different, but we've all got grief in common. Thank you.